Hi guys, it's me. I'm here with Breaking Spectre. We talked about doing this for a couple weeks. I'm reading a couple of chapters out of a book that I had read about, probably finished about a month ago. It is Chaos, the Truth Behind the Manson Murders. We're going to read two chapters today, chapters 7 and 8. I believe that's right, isn't it right, Breaking?
Yep.
And the reason why we chose to read this is because the similarities of what's happening in our world today versus what this book tells you about what was going on in the late 60s and 70s, the race wars, et cetera, et cetera. So,
So,
go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, along those lines, think of this in the context of what we have seen via Q posts and everything else, and the playbook and that the left uses. Um, as we read through this, think of the things that are going on today relative to, like you said, 40, 50 years ago. uh, the level of similarities that were just uncanny in going through this. And biblically speaking, there is nothing new under the sun. And of course, I think you guys will probably see that throughout.
Okay, and with that, we will click over. I'll also provide uh, in the description, I'll put a link to this book, the whole book, if you want to read it. I recommend reading it. It was an easy read for me. It's very thick, but it's really good. And so I would just suggest if you want to read it, this is a good one to spend some time doing that. So this is chapter 7. As you notice the title, it says Neutralizing the Left. And I think Breaking's going to take it here. We're going to go, it's kind of broke down in little bitty subsections. So he's going to read one, I'm going to read the other. I know Breaking's got a better probably he narrates things a little bit better than me, so he might read a little bit more than me. We'll see if I can nudge him into it. He's usually very accommodating.
We'll see. All right.
Okay.
So this chapter is called Neutralizing the Left, Dawn of the Campus Malcontents. Says I couldn't expect a report on the likes of Reeve Whitson or on outrageous claims about intelligence connections and military figures until I learned more about the politics and pressures of California in the 60s. My research was pushing me towards broader connections and social implications, and I didn't always know what to do with them. If Preston Guillory was correct, for instance, uh, then Lasso knew about Manson's plan to attack the Black Panthers. How could the police have known, and why would they have wanted the attack to happen? I had vague notions of the tension between the Panthers and the government, but I couldn't say how it fit in the larger context of protest in the 60s, when the nation's unrest had crystallized in California. The state was the epicenter of the Summer of Love. Where have we heard that before? But it had also seen the ascent of Reagan and Nixon. It had seen the Watts riots, the birth of the anti-war movement, and the ultimate concert disaster, the free speech movement, and the Hells Angels. Here, defense contractors, gold warriors, and nascent tech companies lived just down the road from hippie communes, lev-ins, and surf shops. If there was any truth to Reeve Whitson's story, I needed a crash course in the government's involvement in anti-left action in California, and solid sources to tell me how Manson could have been swept up in it. I focused on two secret intelligence operations that were underway in Los Angeles in 1969, the FBI's COINTELPRO and the CIA's Chaos. Their primary objective, according to three congressional committees that investigated him in the mid-70s, was to discredit the left-wing movement by any means necessary, an aim that, coincidentally or not, described exactly the effect of the Manson murders. The 60s youth movement was born on May 13, 1960, when hundreds of demonstrators, most of them UC Berkeley students, began a two-day protest at San Francisco's City Hall. The House Committee on Un-American Activities had convened a series of hearings there, and students were chagrined to learn that they were barred from the proceedings. A riot broke out as police turned fire hoses on the protesters, the intense pressure forcing them down the building's imposing marble stairway. Police clubbed protesters and made 61 arrests, including more than 30 students. Black Friday, as it came to be known, marked the end of the 50s, the dawn of a new age of dissent. The following day, the demonstrators returned undeterred, this time totaling more than 5,000. The HCUA was cowed. Never again did it conduct hearings beyond the Capitol. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, couldn't believe the left had such strength in numbers. He was convinced that foreign communists sponsored the movement. Thus began a pitched battle between federal law enforcement and young subversives. In the mid-60s, with the war in Vietnam escalating, Berkeley became a hotbed of anti-war activity. Sit-ins were staged on campus. Rallies were held throughout the Bay Area, each growing in size and fervor. Late in 1964, some 1,500 students crowded into Berkeley's Sproul Hall to protest the university's mistreatment of campus activists. More than 700 of them were arrested that day. On January 28, 1965, a distraught Hoover met with the director of the CIA, John McCone, hatching a plan to take corrective action at Berkeley. The CIA's charter prohibited the agency from domestic operations, but McCone collaborated with Hoover nonetheless, hoping to quash the protests. One of their targets was Clark Kerr, the president of UC Berkeley, who was widely perceived as sympathetic to the protesters. McCone and Hoover circulated false information claiming that he had communist ties. They also targeted faculty supporters of the demonstrators and the student leaders themselves. A few months later, McCone resigned from the CIA, having felt unappreciated by President Lyndon Johnson. His next job brought him back to California. He took a post on Ronald Reagan's gubernatorial campaign, shoring up the candidate's credibility with right-leaning voters. Reagan campaigned fervently against the so-called New Left, vowing a swift end to California's burgeoning anti-war movement. Without citing evidence, he claimed that Berkeley had suffered reduced enrollment as a result of the protesters' destructive conduct. If elected, he said, he would appoint McCone to lead a formal investigation of the university's campus malcontents and filthy speech advocates. Reagan won by a landslide. As he cemented his power, anti-war sentiment continued to flower at Berkeley. In April 1970, soon to win a second term, Reagan famously declared war against the movement. If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with, he announced. No more appeasement. The Oval Office was similarly disturbed by the rise of student activism. By 1967, Lyndon Johnson believed that the country was on the verge of a political revolution that could topple him from power. Having mired the nation even further in the Vietnam War, he faced constant jeers at rallies. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? As anti-war demonstrations spilled from campuses into the streets, Johnson ordered the FBI and the CIA to take action. That August, with the president's approval, CIA Director Richard Helms authorized an illegal domestic surveillance program, codenamed Chaos. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover revived the FBI's dormant counterinsurgency program, COINTELPRO. Both agencies opened the first offices of their respective operations in San Francisco, still considered ground zero for the revolution, especially since the founding of the Black Panther Party in nearby Oakland the previous summer. Thanks to these two secret programs and their network of well-placed informants, there was an all-out war raging in California by the summer of '69. The FBI and CIA had induced the left to feed on itself. Among competing factions, what had been sectarian strife had devolved into outright violence. The more I read about it, the more I saw how someone like Charles Manson could fit into a scheme like this. I was only speculating, but I knew that he'd spent a lot of time in Berkeley, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, often inveighing against the Black Panthers, and I had reliable sources suggesting that he was an informant, or at least hanging around with others who could have been. It struck me that the Tate LaBianca murders had been so often invoked as the death knell of the '60s. Arguably, they did more than any other event to turn the public opinion against hippies, recasting the peace and flower power ethos as a thing of latent drug-addled criminality. As writer Todd Gitlin noted, for the mass media, the acid head Charles Manson was ready-made as a monster lurking in the heart of every long hair. Wasn't this the goal of Chaos and COINTELPRO? It was a sound connection in theory. To report it, to take it out of the realm of the hypothetical, seemed an impossible task for someone with no background in national security. But I had to try. And so, feeling the line between researcher and conspiracy theorist blurring before me, I hunkered down in a library to read about the many ways our government has deceived us.
Okay, next. Fomenting violence and unrest. The FBI and the CIA launched their counterintelligence programs in the same month. On August 25, 1967, J. Edgar Hoover issued a memorandum to the chiefs of each of his FBI field offices in the United States, outlining the objective of COINTELPRO. See, the name was an abridgment of Counterintelligence Program, first launched in 1956 to increase factionalism among communists in the United States. COINTELPRO had been activated on and off throughout the early 60s, often to vilify civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King Jr., most prominent among them. In his 67 memo, Hoover formed a new branch of the operation aiming to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of black nationalists, hate-type organizations. The activities of all such groups of intelligence interests to this Bureau must be followed on a continuous basis. Efforts of various groups to consolidate their forces or to recruit new or youthful adherents must be frustrated. No opportunity should be missed to exploit the organizational and personal conflicts of the leaderships of the groups and to capitalize upon existing conflicts between competing black nationalist organizations. Hoover specified more than 20 cities where COINTELPRO methods could be put to effective use, Los Angeles among them. In a later memo, he ordered the Bureau to pinpoint potential troublemakers and neutralize them before they exercise their potential for violence. Informants were COINTELPRO's lifeblood, providing the only effective way for the FBI to learn about and exert influence on the groups it hoped to discredit. The Bureau went to extreme lengths to cultivate solid informants. If it found a convict willing to infiltrate a political group, it would commute his prison sentence. In Quantico, Virginia, at the sprawling Marine Corps base where the FBI would soon open its own academy, a less formal Hoover University trained agents in the delicate art of passing as leftists. They grew unkempt beards, refrained from bathing for days at a time, parroted radical talking points, got stoned, and tripped on acid. In the Black Panther Party and in Los Angeles, the U.S. organization, informants were instrumental in fomenting violence. They would spread disinformation to catalyze on intergroup rivalry, and they'd simply arrange for bloodshed themselves. Founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland in 1966, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, commonly known as the Black Panther Party, had become the, what is that, Bet Nor of whatever, of federal law enforcement. From Hoover on down, the FBI's ranks saw the groups as a threat to the national order, rivaled only by communism and nuclear holocaust. Originally, the Panthers served to safeguard Oakland's black residents from overzealous policing. They promoted lawful, armed self-defense in inner-city neighborhoods, and their social outreach programs brought meals and health care to those who couldn't afford them. Their 10-point program demanded power to determine the destiny of our black community. But as the party grew in size and prominence, opening chapters in nearly every major city in the United States and abroad, it embraced more militant action against the long arm of law enforcement, starting in Oakland. In 1967, Newton shot and killed a cop during a traffic stop. In 68, Eldridge Cleaver, who headed the Panthers' Ministry of Information, was in a firefight during which he and two cops suffered gunshot wounds, and a 17-year-old Panther was killed. That same year, the violence found its way to Los Angeles as gunfights led to 4 Panther deaths. By 1969, the Panthers had been involved in more than a dozen shootouts with police, some the result of ambushes. Fearing infiltration by informants, the party began to implode, purging members, and in one notorious case, torturing and killing a 19-year-old member suspected of being a snitch. Their paranoia was far from unfounded. Hoover's FBI chalked up the internal strife, not to mention the wraths of death, as the victory. COINTELPRO promised a violent repudiation. Repudiation. See, that's why I need him. He helps me. Repudiation of what Hoover had dubbed a hate-type organization. The Bureau's strategy was merciless. Its results disastrous but effective. In Chicago, famously, the FBI recruited William O'Neill, recently charged with impersonating a federal officer and driving a stolen car across state lines to infiltrate the Panthers' Illinois chapter, forgiving those charges in exchange for his services. Soon O'Neill became the personal bodyguard for Fred Hampton, the chapter's chairman. O'Neill's post allowed him to provide the Bureau with a steady stream of intelligence, including detailed floor plans of Hampton's apartment. Although he found no evidence that Hampton or the group posed a threat to anyone's safety, O'Neill continued to inform. In December of 1969, days, coincidentally, after Manson was charged in the Tate LaBianca murders, O'Neill slipped a barbiturate into Hampton's drink over dinner. By the end of the night, the police had raided Hampton's apartment and shot him twice in the head at point-blank range. O'Neill was one of many such informants around the country, and Hampton's death one of many such deaths. The FBI's role may never have come to light if not for the Citizens Committee to investigate the FBI, an audacious crew of activist burglars who took it upon themselves to break into a small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, just west of Philadelphia, one night in March of 1971. The group took a crowbar to that office's dead-bolted door, stuffed suitcases with papers revealing the FBI's domestic spying, which they soon parceled out to the press. Hoover was in high dudgeon? What is that? Dudgeon? See, again, these words. The group's methods were straight out of the FBI playbook. They'd cased the office for months, sending in a woman disguised as a college student to get a sense of the building's security. In his fury, Hoover allocated some 200 agents to track down the burglars, but they were never found. Only in 2014 did they reveal themselves. They were motivated, they said, by a sense that the government had lied to them about Vietnam, and that conventional protest had proven useless. The existence of COINTELPRO was the single most earth-shaking revelation in the stolen documents, among which Hoover's incendiary 67 COINTELPRO memo, the one in which he pledged to discredit and neutralize leftist organizations. With his pet project exposed, Hoover took steps to end COINTELPRO, but the burglary inaugurated a spat of whistleblowing that undermined the FBI's credibility over the next few years. Congressman Hale Boggs, the House Majority Leader, compared the FBI to the secret police, conceding that even Congress lived in fear of them and that they'd hasten the growth of a vine of tyranny. Lawsuits brought under the Freedom of Information Act forced the Attorney General to reveal more incriminating FBI files. By 1975, anti-intelligence sentiment was so high that Congress formed a committee to scrutinize the Bureau. Led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, the committee's investigation exposed FBI duplicity on a scale that had been unthinkable, even after even after the Pennsylvania burglary. The Church Committee's findings, published in '76, gave the nation its first glimpse of the astonishing success that Hoover's counterintelligence operation had seen. As reported in the New York Times that May, the committee's final report determined that FBI headquarters approved more than 2,300 actions in a campaign to disrupt and discredit American organizations ranging from the Black Panthers to Antioch College, and that the Bureau may have violated specific criminal statutes in pursuing actions that invoked risk of serious bodily injury or death to targets. The Church Committee noted that COINTELPRO encompassed a staggering range of targets, and that the FBI's deployment of dangerous, degrading, or blatantly unconstitutional techniques appears to have become less restrained with each subsequent program. Hoover had specifically requested that these techniques be imaginative and hard-hitting, and they were. The FBI tried seemingly everything from gossip to gunfights. The Bureau mailed pejorative articles and newspaper clippings to college administrators. Its agents tried to destroy marriages by writing unsigned, malicious, rumor-mongering letters. They smeared leftists as informants when they weren't, and they stoked the flames of internecine conflicts until they grew into feuds. The committee detailed several of the FBI's exploits in Los Angeles, and by now I wasn't surprised by the scope of the mayhem. The operations described, especially the deadly ones, were equal parts sophisticated and reckless, with the Bureau taking great pains to install informants and incite violence with no care for the consequences. I looked for any signs of Manson, no matter how tangential, any pattern among law enforcement, any familiar name. The most conspiratorial possibility, of course, would be that the FBI had carefully groomed Manson and pressed him into service as COINTELPRO informant. But I knew that was the longest of long shots, and if the facts didn't lead me there, I had no desire to force the connection. Given the FBI's sloppiness, I wondered if Manson could have been implicated in other more indirect ways, willingly or not. Maybe he wasn't an informant, but had been close to someone who was. Maybe someone like Reeve Whitson had influenced his actions from 2 or 3 degrees of removal. Maybe someone at the sheriff's office had assisted the FBI. I was encouraged by one simple fact. The FBI had behaved conspiratorially with COINTELPRO early and often. One of its greatest coups came in January of 1969 when G-men had incited the murders of 2 Black Panthers on the UCLA campus. FBI infiltrators had lied to the Panthers' rivals, the U.S. organization, telling them that the Panthers were meeting on the campus to plan their assassinations. U.S. responded by ambushing 2 Panthers at a Black student union meeting and shooting them dead. LASO, which stands for Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, knew that the Panthers were murdered because of the FBI's meddling. They didn't care. In fact, they hid the FBI's role in the violence. In their eyes, the most desirable outcome had been achieved. 2 Panthers were dead. 3 U.S. gang members were in jail, and the American public was more fearful of Black militants. The FBI used the incident to spur more violence between U.S. and the Panthers, according to a 1970 memo from the Los Angeles field office. The Los Angeles division is aware of mutually hostile feelings harbored between the organizations, and the first opportunity to capitalize on the situation will be maximized. It is intended that the U.S. Inc. will be appropriately and discreetly advised of the time and location of BPP, the Black Panther Party, activities in order that the two organizations might be brought together and thus grant nature the opportunity to take due course. I'm going to say right here, think about it all the times we know that they've organized Antifa and Patriots to be at the same place, and then they do nothing to try and divide them or keep them separated. Just going to insert that there. That emphasis comes from the church committee, who noted that due course in this case meant nothing less than first-degree murder. The committee's final report blasted the FBI for its complicity in the deaths of the Panthers. The chief investigative branch of the federal government engaged in lawless tactics and responded to deep-seated social problems by fomenting violence and unrest. It wrote, "Equally disturbing is the pride which those officials took in claiming credit for the bloodshed that occurred. Indeed, it seemed that whenever the FBI made headway with its tactics, it doubled down. Rather than halt its provocation, why can't I say that word? Provocations. Halt its provocations as the Panthers and the U.S. organization claimed each other's lives. The FBI escalated the campaign, spreading propaganda, including political cartoons, designed to inflame the violence. The FBI viewed this carnage as a positive development," the church committee wrote. Maybe the most lacerating testimony came from William Sullivan, a high-ranking FBI official who'd helped implement COINTELPRO before Hoover fired him in 1971. Sullivan had masterminded an episode in which Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife, received a recording in which her husband could be heard flirting with another woman. Sullivan had deemed King a fraud, demagogue, and scoundrel. Now, before the church committee, he allowed that the FBI's ruthless pragmatism had obscured any sense of morality he and his colleagues might have had. "Never once," he said, "did I hear anybody, including myself, raise the question, is this course of action which we have agreed upon lawful? Is it legal? Is it ethical or moral? The one thing we were concerned about was this: will this course of action work? Will it get us what we want?" They didn't care about following the law. They just wanted what they wanted. COINTELPRO excesses were well documented, but the FBI's director, Clarence M. Kelly, who succeeded Hoover, refused to admit wrongdoing, defending the operations as a necessary precaution against violent extremists who'd hoped to bring America to its knees, he added. For the FBI to have done less under the circumstances would have been an abdication of its responsibilities to the American people.
Sounds pretty familiar.
I know, trust me. That's why we're reading it, guys. Go ahead.
Yeah, parallels are uncanny. Lined up against the wall with the rest of the whites. When Hoover reconstituted COINTELPRO, he was already worried that America's black militants would be embraced by liberal whites, especially in a left-leaning place like Hollywood. And the August 1967 memo reanimating the counterintelligence program, he noted the importance of preventing militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability. They must be discredited to the white community, both the responsible community and to the liberals who have vestiges of sympathy for militant black nationalists simply because they are Negroes. 2 years later, the Panthers had become almost synonymous with Hollywood's liberal elite. Actresses such as Jane Fonda and Jean Seberg appeared at their rallies. Hoover felt he had to widen the chasm between blacks and whites in Los Angeles. In a November 1968 memo, an LA field agent discussed new efforts to spread disinformation to Hollywood's liberal whites. In the context of the Tate LaBianca murders, the memo is chilling. Remember, the Tate House by then had become a high-profile gathering place for liberal Hollywood, among others for Fonda, Cass Elliot, and Warren Beatty, all three of whom were under FBI surveillance. Abigail Folger, who would die at the hands of the family, was an outspoken civil rights activist. That year, she campaigned for Tom Bradley, the first African-American candidate for mayor of Los Angeles. Many in the Polanski-Tate crowd belonged to the White Panther Party, explicit allies of the Black Panthers, or to the Peace and Freedom Party of California, which also voiced its support. The FBI, according to the memo, planned to generate distrust through disinformation. The Peace and Freedom Party, PFP, has been furnishing the BPP with financial assistance. An anonymous letter is being prepared for Bureau approval to be sent to a leader of PFP, in which it is set forth that the BPP has made statements in closed meetings that when the armed rebellion comes, the whites in the PFP will be lined up against the wall with the rest of the whites. Emphasis, mine. The FBI would make it seem as if even sympathetic leftists were in the Panthers' crosshairs. Less than a year after this memo was written, Manson's followers lined up 4 denizens of liberal Hollywood in Roman Polanski's home and cut them to pieces, leaving slogans in blood to implicate the Black Panthers. Of course, the FBI couldn't have done this work alone. They needed local law enforcement on their side, and, according to the church committee, they got it. The committee looked into one of the most notorious COINTEL actions in L.A., the framing of Gerard Geronimo Pratt, a Black Panther and a decorated Vietnam vet. Pratt would be in prison for 27 years for a murder the FBI knew he didn't commit. He was in Oakland at the time of the crime, 400 miles away, at a Black Panther house that the Bureau had wiretapped. It had transcripts of a call he'd made to the Panther headquarters in Los Angeles just hours before the murder. Still, Bureau agents enlisted a federal informant to lie on the stand about Pratt's involvement. Even before the frame-up, FBI gunmen had attempted to kill Pratt by shooting at him through the window of his apartment. He survived only because a spine injury he'd sustained in the war made it more comfortable to sleep on the floor. Pratt was serving a life sentence when the church committee released its landmark findings, confirming what he'd long suspected. Lasso and the LAPD were complicit in the COINTELPRO operation. The committee quoted a report that the FBI's Los Angeles outpost had sent to Hoover himself, advising that the Los Angeles field office of the FBI is furnishing on a daily basis information to the LA County Sheriff's Office Intel Division and the Los Angeles Police Department's Intelligence and Criminal Conspiracy Divisions concerning the activities of Black nationalist groups in the anticipation that such information might lead to the arrest of the militants. By the church committee's estimation, this meant that the Los Angeles law enforcement was guilty of obstructing justice and hindering prosecution.
Okay, Manson, the race warrior. If there was a bridge between the family and COINTELPRO, I thought it probably stemmed from this basic fact. Charles Manson was a racist. According to Greg Jacobson, Manson sincerely believed that the black man's sole purpose on earth was to serve the white man. Another member of the family recalled that Manson looked forward to the day when, having survived the apocalyptic race war, he could scratch Blackie's fuzzy head and kick him in the butt and tell him to go pick the cotton. And at the start of 1969, as COINTELPRO provoked black militants in L.A., Manson's bigotry reached a delusional fever pitch. He became convinced, seemingly without a shred of evidence, that the Black Panthers were spying on the family at this fan ranch, planning an attack on him. His paranoia mounting, Manson placed armed guards at every entrance to the ranch, sending lookouts to the mountains with powerful telescopes. His fear was self-fulfilling in a way. On July 1st of 1969, during a dispute over drug money in a Hollywood apartment, Manson shot Bernard Latsapapa Crow, a black drug dealer. According to Helter Skelter, the dealer had told Manson that he was a Panther and that his brothers would come and get Manson at the ranch if he didn't pay up. Manson shot Crow in the chest and fled the scene, believing he'd killed the dealer. Back at the ranch, Manson was sure that Crow's friends were readying their attack. In Buglosi's account, this contributed to Manson's decision a month later to speed along the race war by inciting helter-skelter. The Tate LaBanca murders would sow racial discord. Okay, in this book, Buglosi was the prosecutor in the Manson trial. But Bernard Crow wasn't a Black Panther, and he survived after Manson shot him. Buglosi even called him to the stand during the trial. I always have trouble with this man's name. Bugliosi chalked it up to a misunderstanding on Manson's part, but the more I thought about it, especially in the light of what I'd learned about the COINTELPRO, the more I wondered if there was more to the story. The prosecutor reported that Manson was already frightened of the Black Panthers before the Crow shooting. If Manson were truly scared of the Panthers, the last thing he would have done is shoot a man who he believed to be a Panther, a man who'd already told his, quote, brothers where Manson lived, and made a threat to kill him. True, Manson hoped to launch a race war, but he didn't want to be caught in its crossfire. This was a fate he wished on other whites, but never on himself. Furthermore, Tex Watson's girlfriend and 3 of Crow's friends had witnessed the shooting. They called an ambulance after Manson made his getaway. At the hospital, Crow refused to tell the police who'd shot him. Wouldn't the police have questioned the 4 witnesses? Did Crow even say who they were? Why didn't the police pursue a near-fatal shooting with plenty of witnesses, especially when the alleged shooter was a paroled ex-con? We might never know. Bugliosi doesn't clarify any of it in Helter Skelter. I'd always considered the Crow shooting an inexplicable sideshow in the Manson circus. It took on grander proportions after I'd learned about the FBI's disinformation campaign against the Panthers. At this same time, this same place, less than a week after the Tate murders, further COINTELPRO provocations led to the shootings of 3 more Panthers, one of them fatal.
So, the CIA on domestic soil. And obviously, most of us who know should recognize that that's not supposed to happen, but of course we know that it does. In August 1967, the same month Hoover launched COINTELPRO, CIA Director Richard Helms inaugurated the agency's aforementioned illegal domestic surveillance program, CHAOS, which also employed agents and informants to infiltrate quote-unquote subversive groups and then quote-unquote neutralize them. CHAOS was born of Lyndon Johnson's neurosis. In the summer of '67, the president was convinced that the divided, disorderly America he led couldn't possibly be the product of his own policies. Foreign agents and presumably foreign money must be to blame. He ordered the CIA to prove that the nation's dissidents, and especially its anti-war movement, had their origins abroad. Russia, anybody? Richard Helms complied without hesitation. In the 6 years that followed, the CIA tracked thousands of Americans, insulating its information gathering so thoroughly that even those at the top of its counterintelligence division were clueless about its domestic surveillance. KS kept tabs on 300,000 people, more than 7,000 of them American citizens. The agency shared information with the FBI, the White House, and the Justice Department. At its peak, KS had 52 dedicated agents, most of whom served to infiltrate anti-war groups like their counterparts in the FBI. Undercover, they hoped to identify Russian instigators, although they never found any. Mueller, anybody? With the Interdivision Intelligence Unit, IDIU, a new branch of the Justice Department outfitted with sophisticated computerized databases, they collaborated on a list of more than 10,000 names, all thought to be dangerous activists. The IDIU produced regular reports on these people, hoping to predict their activities. The journalist Seymour Hersh got wind of chaos late in 1974. He told James Jesus Angleton, the head of CIA counterintelligence, and William Colby, the director of the CIA, that he had a story bigger than my lay about CIA domestic activities. Colby was forced to admit that Hirsch's findings were accurate, and Angleton resigned from the agency. The story broke on December 22nd on the front page of the New York Times. Huge CIA operation reported in U.S. against anti-war forces, other dissidents in Nixon years. The Church Committee probed the CIA's illegal activities, as did a separate government investigation, the Rockefeller Commission. But neither was able to penetrate the agency's veil of secrecy. Since the CIA has no right to operate on American soil, the program should have brought even more censure than COINTELPRO. Instead, it drew only a muted response. CIA leadership stonewalled at every opportunity. Even if they hadn't, investigators were crippled by the dearth of information. When Richard Helms had disbanded Chaos before leaving office in 1973, he ordered the destruction of every file pertaining to it. And since the 70s, almost nothing has come out. The operation hardly left a footprint. Even if reams of paperwork had survived, the Rockefeller Commission was hardly willing to press the agency. While the commission made some shocking findings, evidence of wiretaps, bugging, and hidden burglaries, in addition to extensive record-keeping mentioned above, by the end of the 70s, well after it had disbanded, allegations arose that it had suppressed information. Its chairman, Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, had worked with the CIA in the late 50s. In a memoir, former CIA Director Colby later claimed that President Gerald Ford fired him for refusing to help Rockefeller sabotage his own investigation. According to Colby, Chaos was so highly classified that even he, the director of the CIA, didn't have access to it. I found it impossible to do much about whatever was wrong with Chaos, he wrote. Its super secrecy and extreme compartmentalization kept me very much on its periphery. In the spring of '78, the New York Times revealed that the investigations into Chaos had been woefully inadequate. When one agent was asked why he hadn't been more forthcoming, he said simply, "They didn't ask." The true extent of the agency's domestic activities against dissidents would probably never be known, the Times declared. But the paper had been able to uncover Chaos activities from the late 60s that had targeted the Black Panther Party. Rockefeller's commission failed to reveal that between 150 and 200 CIA domestic files on black dissidents had been destroyed, the Times reported. The CIA conducted at least 2 major programs involving the use of American blacks. When the Panthers, organized by young blacks in the mid-60s, were publicly advocating revolutionary change. Just how successful the CIA was in those alleged activities could not be determined.
Winning hearts and minds. Knowing more about Chaos and COINTELPRO, I felt that men like Reeve Whitson were potentially much more common than I anticipated. Always in peripheral, undefined roles. Part of the reason that Whitson seemed like such a wild card to me was that he appeared to have walked on the scene from nowhere. An outre, worldly man suddenly hobnobbing with the LAPD's top brass. I wanted others to fit that profile, to cover up an operation like Chaos. The agency needed friends in law enforcement, insiders who could make arrests or, just as important, not make arrests. The most promising but frustrating of my inquiries concerned an LAPD officer named William H. Herman. I could never connect him to Whitson or Manson, but he certainly fit the profile of someone who'd helped with the counterintelligence actions. When I was deep in the weeds of my Chaos research, split between feeling that I was onto something or that I was risking my credibility, Herman's was a name that came up several times, usually from sources I didn't quite trust or in arcane articles from the alternative press. What I'd heard about him was just plausible enough to get me to look closer, but I'm glad I did. Herman's story hints to how intelligence agencies may have collaborated with police in L.A. A longtime lieutenant with the LAPD, Herman had an unusual background for law enforcement. He'd had a doctorate in psychology. He specialized in quelling insurgencies. He developed one of the first computer systems to track criminals and predict violent outbreaks in cities. Daryl Gates, the head of the LAPD from 1978 to 1992, hailed him as a genius, praising his technical aptitude in particular. But Herman's work wasn't limited to Los Angeles or even to the United States. My FOIA request to the FBI yielded a collection of redacted documents detailing his extensive employment history. Concurrent with his time in the LAPD, he'd worked under contract for a dizzying list of American intelligence and military agencies: the Air Force, the Secret Service, the Treasury Department, the President's Office of Science and Technology, the Institute for Defense Analysis, the Defense Industrial Security Clearance Office, the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency. Most of his work for these groups remains classified. You'd think these projects wouldn't have left much free time, but Herman piled on even more work, taking leave of absence from the LAPD to pursue side gigs with defense firms. These had opaque generic names like Electro-Optical Systems, Systems Development Corp., and Controlled Data Corp. This last, a weapons manufacturer in Minneapolis, relied on Herman's services for 10 years, from 1961 to 1971, or so Herman told the FBI. When the Bureau went to Control Data Corp for a background check, the company claimed that Herman never worked for them. You might have guessed, given Herman's long list of government employers, I wondered if his work for these defense contractors could have been a front for the CIA, one of the few agencies that didn't appear on his resume. As usual, official channels were useless. My FOIA request to the CIA for Herman's records yielded the same neither confirm or deny response that Reeve Whitson had. I did find, however, a record of Herman's overseas work, much of which he conducted while still employed with the LAPD. Having spent 4 months in 1967 training Thai police in counterinsurgency tactics, Herman returned to Asia in September of 1968 to join the U.S. effort in South Vietnam. Documents from the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, listed him as a scientific advisor to the Army. His responsibilities was to train South Vietnamese police in paramilitary techniques to deploy against Viet Cong insurgents. None of the records describe those techniques in any detail, but the mere mention of them was enough to make me put a few things together. The dates of Herman's stint in Vietnam, his job description, his professional affiliations, and his training made it abundantly likely he was working for a CIA project called Phoenix, one of the most controversial elements in the agency's history. Richard Nixon had secretly authorized Phoenix in 1968. It was discontinued in early 1971. The agency described it as a set of programs that sought to attack and destroy the political infrastructure of the Viet Cong. Inside Vietnam, Phoenix operatives waged a campaign of terror against the Viet Cong guerrillas, with tactics including the assassination and torture of non-combatant civilians. According to a 1971 congressional investigation, the program violated the codes of the Geneva Conventions and revealed the Viet Cong's own terrorism and its mercilessness. During the Senate hearing, the number of Phoenix operatives admitted to massacring civilians and making it appear that the atrocities were the work of the Viet Cong. Their hope was to win the hearts and minds of neutral Vietnamese citizens, compelling them to turn away from the insurgencies in revulsion. A Special Forces soldier, Anthony Herbert, the single most decorated combat veteran of Vietnam, published a best-selling book, Soldier, the detailed typical orders from his Phoenix superiors. They wanted me to take charge of execution teams that wiped out entire families and tried to make it appear as though the Viet Cong had done it themselves. The rationale was that the Viet Cong would see that other Viet Cong had killed their own and make an allegiance with us, the good guys. Their attempts were sometimes even more unhinged. In 1968, the CIA scientists at the Bain Ha prison outside Saigon surgically opened the skulls of 3 prisoners, implanted electrodes on their brains, gave them daggers, and left them alone in a room. They wanted to shock the prisoners into killing one another. When the effort failed, the prisoners were shot and their bodies were burned. According to the Seymour Hersh's 1972 book, Cover Up, Phoenix had committees set up across all 44 provinces in South Vietnam. They kept blacklists of Viet Cong fighters and had strict orders to meet weekly or monthly quotas of neutralizations. The whole operation relied on computerized indexes. The identity of its CIA leader never came to light, but whoever he was there ostensibly as part of the Agency for International Development, or AID, later revealed as a CIA front. Herman, of course, was known for his aptitude with computers, and his time in Vietnam coincided almost exactly with Phoenix's operations. The papers I found at the National Archives confirmed that he was part of AID. I had no way to press him about any of this. He died in 1993. As I had with Whitson, I wondered whether his family could tell me more about him. I found one of his daughters, Cindy, a dog breeder in Spokane, Washington. She invited me to see her. Only a teenager in the 60s, she didn't have many memories of her father's work, but she was confident that much of it had been top secret and that he had worked for the CIA. He never discussed his work with his family, not even her mother. She was instructed never to talk about her father with anyone, including extended family. She knew he did undercover work both while he was with the LAPD and afterward. She showed me his passport. Visa stamps chronicled at least 4 trips to Vietnam between 68 and 70. Among his ID cards was one for the Exot Hop Vietnam Cong HOA. She also shared several documents confirming Herman's participation in Phoenix, a framed memo from the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam dated September 9th of 1968, advised all personnel that Herman was a member of the Pacification Task Force working for Ambassador Comer. Comer's first name, Robert, was nicknamed Blowtorch Bob for his take-no-prisoners approach to warfare. He served 15 years in the CIA before arriving in Vietnam to work on Phoenix. According to the Senate testimony, he was behind the program's notorious kill quotas. Even Herman's Infira captivated me. Cindy had held onto a photo of dozens of men on an airplane captioned "Bad Guys Leaving a Bad Spot after having been bad." Once he returned from Vietnam, Herman retired from the LAPD after more than 20 years on the force, embarking on a series of research gigs for various federal agencies, again, all top secret. With information from Cindy, a growing pile of press clippings, and the government documents I'd amassed, I tried to piece together Herman's post-retirement projects. Whatever he'd learned in Southeast Asia, he brought it back to LA. His work in California bore disturbing resemblances to the techniques he'd honed as part of the Phoenix Project. In 1968, Governor Reagan appointed him head of a new riots and disorders task force dedicated to studying urban unrest and devising ways to prevent future outbreaks of violence. But in a 1970 interview, Herman revealed, maybe by accident, that the task force was hardly the research-based enterprise it had claimed to be. Herman didn't give many interviews, but when he spoke to the London Observer's Charles Foley in May of 1970, he was apparently in a voluble mood, discussing his work for the task force. He described a program of spying and infiltration far exceeding the studies that the group had committed to. His words sound as if they'd been lifted from COINTELPRO and Chaos manuals. Both of those operations, of course, were well underway in LA. Like Governor Reagan and President Johnson, Herman believed that California's students' descendants were funded by foreign communists. He told the Observer that he had a secret plan for forestalling revolution in America. The key was to split off those bent on destroying the system from the mass of dissenters, then following classic guerrilla warfare theory to find means which will win their hearts and minds. He called this plan simply Saving America, and it included strategies for deeper penetration by undercover agents into dissenting groups, such as Army agents posing as students and news reporters. In a turn worthy of Minority Report, he wanted to use mathematical probability models to predict when and where violence would erupt. He also called for the use of long-range electronic surveillance devices. If informants had already penetrated any dissenting groups, they would secretly record speeches and conversations. What that information would be used for and how Herman didn't say. He spoke of the task force in the future tense, making it hard to discern how operational its saving America tactics were. Whatever the case, his brazen claims generated backlash from the left. His daughter showed me a flyer from the Students for a Democratic Society depicting him as a pig. Maybe he felt he'd said too much, or maybe his superiors told him so, but a few months later he gave another, more circumspect interview, talking this time to the Sacramento Bee. He walked back some of his more chilling claims about saving America. Herman bridles at an article in the London Observer, the reporter wrote, quoting Herman, "The council could not set up a plan like that. We have a non-operational role. All we can do is review and fund projects suggested by local authorities." Saving America sounded a lot like COINTELPRO, which sounded a lot like chaos. They all ran together, in part, it seemed, because they'd all shared notes. In June of 2002, the San Francisco Chronicle published an investigative series detailing Governor Reagan's secret dealings with the CIA and the FBI, all part of his effort to halt what he constructed as a communist-sponsored anti-war movement in California. The Chronicle revealed an internal FBI memo from July of 1969, when Herbert Ellenwood, one of the governor's top advisors, visited FBI headquarters to discuss Reagan's plans for the destruction of disruptive elements on California campuses. As the Chronicle reported, Ellenwood asked the FBI for intelligence information against protest groups. The FBI had secretly given the Reagan administration such assistance in the past. J. Edgar Hoover himself approved the request. The FBI suggested that the California state government might attack descendants, though, a psychological warfare campaign. If that's what Reagan wanted, he didn't have to look far. In his own circle of advisors was Herman, the chairman of the Riots and Disorders Task Force, a veteran of Phoenix, and a man whose anti-leftist ideas jibbed perfectly with the Reagan administration in Sacramento, to say nothing of the FBI and CIA's. In 1978, Congressional Committee uncovered evidence that the CIA had operatives in at least one city's district attorney's office in the late 60s. I wondered if a similar situation existed in Los Angeles, and if so, whose those operatives might have been. It wouldn't have been too difficult an agency to penetrate. At the time of the Manson murders in 1969, the district attorney of Los Angeles was Eveli Younger, whose resume linked him to tons of intelligence work. Decades earlier, he'd been one of the top agents at Hoover's FBI. In 1942, he left the Bureau to join the Office of Strategic Services. Trained in espionage and counterintelligence techniques, he opted to enroll in law school after the war. In the 50s, Younger was elected to the bench before becoming LA's district attorney in '64. A staunch Republican and a friend of Governor Reagan, He was appointed head of a federal law and order task force in January of 1969, organized by incoming President Richard Nixon to crack down on crime and internal threats to the nation's security, according to the 1974 book Big Brother and the Holding Company. The World Behind Watergate. The politically ambitious Younger advised Nixon to appoint tougher judges, use more wiretaps, encourage space-age techniques and hardware, and support local police with better training and equipment. Younger subordinates in the DA's office referred to him as the General. In his obituary, the Los Angeles Times in 1989 noted that he was the first prosecutor in America to undertake mass felony prosecutions of college campus demonstrators in the 1960s. He prosecuted students who protested the absence of a Black Studies program at a San Fernando Valley State College. The November 1969 trial resulted in 20 convictions, a coup for the up-and-coming deputy DA who tried the case, Vincent Bugliosi. If the CIA wanted a presence in the Los Angeles DA's office, Younger didn't strike me as someone who put his foot down, nor did his second-in-command, Lynn Buck Compton, who'd been an LAPD detective before getting his law degree and joining the DA's office. Compton was the lead prosecutor in the trial of Suron B. Suron for the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and he'd been a World War II hero. His exploits with the Parachute Infantry Regiment, the East Company, were chronicled in the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers. I found a letter that Compton wrote to Herman in March 14th of 1969, 5 months after the Tate LaBianca murders, thanking him for obtaining good advance intelligence on subversaries and militants. The two had served together on the LAPD in the 50s, so I wasn't surprised that they knew each other. I was surprised that Compton had written a note that all but proved that he and Herman were operating behind their remit for the state of California. Neither man had any business gathering advance intelligence on subversives and militants, or anyone else for that matter. The DA's office was supposed to prosecute crimes, not prevent them, and Herman, in his strenuous correction to the London Observer article, had stressed that his role was non-operational.
Coda, front page news. I read about chaos and COINTELPRO until I must have sounded to all my friends like a tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorist, someone who might go off on a long-winded tangent about the threats of the deep state. But the fact that the CIA has become an all-purpose scapegoat, the preeminent symbol of global power run amok, doesn't change the fact that its abuse of power in the 60s were legitimate and myriad. If anything, these abuses were so gross that they've lent authority to any and every claim against federal intelligence agencies. If the CIA and the FBI are capable of killing American citizens in cold blood, often in elaborate schemes, what aren't they capable of? There had been a day in the summer of '69 when the major elements from my reporting collided on a single page of the LA Times. On an August 12th article about the DA's argument in the UCLA Panther murder trial, Panther killings result of power play, jury told, ran next to a piece on the LAPD's theory that the LaBianca killers were imitating the people who'd murdered the Tate victims the night before. Police see copycat killer in slaying of Los Feliz couple. The irony was that both of these stories were wrong. The LaBianca murders weren't the work of a copycat killer, and the police should have known by then the real power play at UCLA was perpetrated by the FBI. I was tantalized by the juxtaposition of the two items, by how much of the quote-unquote news in them was flawed when it was first reported, and by how much of it might be flawed still. Manson's race war motive dovetailed almost too perfectly with the goals of these federal agencies and the DA's office. And programs like Chaos and COINTELPRO, and in people like Reeve Whitson, William Herman, and Buck Compton, I saw the potential for a major turn in my reporting, even as I tried to accept that so much of what they did would always be untraceable. Still, If nefarious plots from the CIA and FBI had eventually exploded into public view, I thought I should at least try to see where my hunches led me. What I wanted to answer was this: how did a body like the Los Angeles DA's office exert its political force? If it wanted to be of service to a higher agency like the FBI or the CIA, would that be easily accomplished? Or was I veering too much into the realm of paranoia? I didn't have to look very far to see how the DA's office wielded its power. One glaring example came at the start of the Manson trial when, without anyone being the wiser, the DA's office conspired to make sure that its narrative for the Tate LaBianca murders was the only one that anyone ever heard. Well, there you have it, folks. That's chapter 7 of the book Chaos, called Neutralizing the Left. Told you it was going to be very interesting. What'd you guys think? Talking about COINTELPRO, the FBI's operation, talking about Chaos, the CIA's operation, all that good stuff. How do those things compare and contrast to the things we're seeing play out today in regards to the Flynn case, or even FISA-gate, or any others that you can think of? Do we honestly believe that those operations technically stopped? I certainly don't. I think they're still ongoing. So we're going to have a lot more to say and more analysis in that here towards the end, but that is the end of Chapter 7. We'll have Chapter 8 for you here momentarily. So stick around and check back for that here real soon. Take care, everybody.